Hello, my name is Cassy Dorff. I am an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. This is the OPSC, the Online Peace Science Colloquium, which I run with Brad Smith, who is also at Vanderbilt University. This started in 2015 when the Peace Science Society, who we're affiliated with, wanted to help celebrate excellent research that happens both before and after the peace science meetings, and to share this research with a broader audience online. So that's what we do, and we post this for everyone to see and to watch. We also have this on our website. So today we have a talk by Sabrina Karim and Sarah Berens, and we have two discussants. So I'm just going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves real quick. Actually, I think we can't hear because there's like some double screen sharing happening, at least on my end.
So I guess, are we just going in order of authors first and then?
Oh no, we're gonna have Nick introduce himself as a discussant first.
Me?
Yes.
Okay. My name's Nick Barnes. I'm a visiting assistant professor at Grinnell College currently, and next year I'll be a lecturer at the University of St. Andrews. Is that all?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
And our second discussant?
Hello, my name is Omar Garcia-Ponce. I'm an assistant professor at George Washington University, and I study criminal political violence.
Thanks so much. So today, our paper by Sabrina and Sarah is called Conflict or Crime: How Victimization Shapes Preferences for Public Goods Provision in Liberia. So now, if whoever's starting off this presentation would like to go ahead and share their screen and unmic, we'll hear a presentation from you for about 15 or so minutes, and I'll give you a 2-minute warning, and then we'll open it up for our discussion, and we'll go ahead and start with Nick with those comments. Make sure to unmute.
Okay. Can everybody see the slides? Just to make sure.
Your Skype is sort of on top of them. Yeah, now I can see them. Oops.
Okay. Oops.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, sorry. Lots of different kinds of technology that we're all working with. Okay, actually, let me, wait, how do I make sure that you, okay, don't appear. All right, okay, we're ready to start. Okay, well, thank you for hosting us to the Peace Science Society, but also to the discussants. This is kind of like the dream team discussant group, so I'm really thankful for your time, especially during a time like this. So to give you a little background about the paper, so Sarah Berens was a visiting Cornell in the fall of 2018, and she gave this presentation on Latin America and crime, and I had just been going through my data from Liberia on a RCT that I had run, and then I had this, survey to do something with, and there were these interesting findings related to public good preferences, and so we decided to combine forces on this paper. And so this is like a bit of a side project for both of us, kind of bringing in both of our expertise, and this has not been submitted anywhere yet. We are at the draft stage, so we welcome all kinds of feedback at this stage. This is kind of like a first or second draft, if you will, of the paper. And so with that, then I'll just kind of dive in. So the main motivation for this paper comes from the fact that there's been two separate literatures kind of growing in different silos. So we have on one hand the war victimization literature that has focused a lot on how war creates these spaces for pro-sociality or for more collective action. And the other strand being obviously crime victimization. So what are the effects of crime victimization on political participation? And so we kind of identifying these two different strands of literature, wanted to put them together And also kind of look at this question of like, what happens to the people that experience both? Because the literature, again, more or less treats this kind of victimization as either or and not necessarily an and. And so that's been kind of our goal. And so this leads to the research question of under what conditions does victimization from civil conflict and or crime affect preferences for public goods provision? And Sarah's going to go into talking about public goods provision.
All right. So public goods preferences differ along the type of public good that is provided to who is going to benefit from public goods, and they vary over targeting. Continue?
Yeah.
Thanks. The welfare state literature so far has just started to address priorities and prioritizing regarding public goods preferences, and has looked at trade-offs between different types of social policies and different types of public goods. Classic public goods can be, can you go on? Click, Sabrina?
Yeah.
Sorry. So the government cannot, of course, provide public goods for everyone, and because budgets are constrained, especially in developing countries. So not everyone's public goods preferences can be fulfilled. When we talk about public goods, there are classical categories that come to mind. One can classify public goods as welfare goods. Here it is, for instance, healthcare or education. Basic goods such as electricity or water, security, and infrastructure. Next slide. In order to understand preferences for different types of public goods, we can distinguish how far the individual perceives the good to be beneficial for him or herself or for the entire community. So here we build on the classical concepts of egotropic and sociotropic types of preferences. When I personally benefit, then it is an egotropic preference. When I may benefit or not benefit, but it's the society that benefits, then it is a sociotropic preference that we're talking about here. Next. We can distinguish now these preferences along a further dimension that is pro-sociality. So when I am pro-social in nature oriented, then I want the public good to be oriented toward welfare and benefits for the entire community. So this allows us to categorize different types of public goods along a ranking. So here we can have a continuum of serving a public goal when we think of different types of public goods. And this starts on the one hand with social investment public goods. These are most pro-social in nature, and this is what we talk about when we think of education. Then comes social consumption, such as pensions, basic public goods, infrastructure, and on the end of the pole, it would be security goods. Security mostly serves an egotropic goal. So what affects these pro-social preferences? And here our response is victimization. Sabrina? You gone?
Yes, yeah. Sorry. Can you see the slide?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I can see. Yes. So the war victimization literature mostly agrees on the fact that experiencing violence during wartime increases pro-social attitudes and pro-social behavior. Go on. And the mechanism here is post-traumatic growth theory. When individuals overcome the collective experience of war, this coping process leads to pro-social attitudes and behavior. On the other side, we have a much more mixed pattern for the crime victimization literature. Here we do have findings that show that crime victimization increases non-electoral political engagement, but we also see findings that show that perception of insecurity reduces political activism, it reduces trust in institutions, willingness to pay taxes, or horizontal trust. In contrast, it raises support for authoritarianism and support for extrajudicial means, and also anger.
Okay, so what does this all mean? How do we all put it together? So if we were to put together kind of all these different strands of literature, the argument that we're trying to make is that victimization is going to affect pro-social preferences for public goods. And this is going to depend on the type of victimization, right? So on one hand, we have this conflict victimization. So you've been a victim of violence during a political conflict. And this, we say, is more of a collective experience, right? So this is the argument about why conflict victimization might lead to more pro-social beliefs. So it's a collective experience, people share it together, and this, can lead to more collective action or this desire to be more community-oriented, et cetera. And so that means that we should expect that people that have been victimized by conflict to hold the most sociotropic views. And so this means that they're both going to be thinking about the community, and they're also going to be thinking about the most welfare maximizing policy for the community. So we say that conflict victimization is going to lead to sociotropic social protection preferences. The opposite, on the opposite side, is crime victimization. And so one point to make here is that when we are talking about crime in this paper, we're not talking about organized crime. So we're kind of scoping that out for now. I think that's an important point to make, just because it's unclear where it would actually fit. It's kind of like in between conflict and crime. We welcome feedback on how to incorporate organized crime, but we're basically talking about individual petty crime that people might experience on an everyday basis on their street. And so this is individualistic, and it's not, the perpetrator isn't after some collective goal, but rather just it's an individual motive. And so this is going to lead to the least pro-social policy preferences, the egotropic security policy preference. And so this leads us to a series of hypotheses. So the first hypothesis is related to conflict. Here, conflict victimization, as I mentioned, increases support for the most sociotropic policy. So it increases support for sociotropic social protection over other types of public goods. Next, with crime victimization, again, just this kind of petty crime is going to increase support for egotropic security public goods over other types of public goods. Now, when it gets a little tricky is with this compound victimization. So we remain agnostic theoretically about what is going to happen, and rather treat this paper as a way to kind of be the first to test the possible ways that preferences could change as a result of compound victimization. So first, it's very possible that the war victimization mechanism might win out. And so hypothesis 3A is that individuals who have experienced both war and crime victimization are going to prefer the social protection type of goods. It's possible that maybe crime victimization wins the day, in which case then we would see that we have a higher preference for security over other public goods. It's also possible that these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive preferences, but that it's an additive effect. So just like you have an additive effect or compound victimization, you might have compound preferences or additive preferences in terms of social protection and security over other public goods. And lastly, if you have maybe both types of victimization, maybe they cancel themselves out and we have no relationship or a preference for none of these. Right? Okay, so then we get into case selection. And the point here to make is that this, we can talk about generalization and what makes sense for developing this theory and where it can be tested. But these data come from Liberia, and not just it's not a representative survey of the entire country, but rather, if you can see through the pointer, this little county right here called Grand Cru, where I have spent a lot of time doing research, and that's actually where I was randomizing police patrols. And so I had the survey data from that county, and the reason for choosing this county is because it's kind of it's not an extreme case. So it's a county that experienced the violence, but not to the most extreme level. It's also a county that has normal levels of crime. So it's kind of like this average conflict and average crime-ridden county. It's also one of the most isolated and one of the counties that has the least amount of services. So we want to know what kind of preferences people have, and if the government is to provide services there. A little bit of background. The Liberian War happened from 1989 to 2003. It was very violent. I mentioned we're looking at Grand Cru specifically. Other things to mention is that it's ethnically homogenous, which is helpful. It experienced violence by both the state and the rebel forces. Like I said, there's moderate levels of violence compared to other counties and moderate levels of crime, low levels of government and goods and services. Okay, so I have conducted a survey face-to-face with 724 individuals in this county, selected in randomly selected 10 villages. The dependent variable is 2 questions from this survey asked in a egotropic and a sociotropic way. So the first question is, what is the most important thing the government should do for you? And the second is, what is the most important thing the government should do for the community? My expectation was that maybe these 2 things were the same, but my enumerators were the ones that were actually pushing for 2 different kinds of questions because they thought that there would actually be a lot of variation. And actually that's what we find, depending on how you ask this question. And then so what the other innovation that we had in this survey was to ask this open-endedly. And so then we postcoded these public goods preferences in these different categories, which is an innovation in how the survey questions about public good preferences are normally asked. And then we, like Sarah said, we categorize them into these categories, which is a standard practice. And then here, just to give you some descriptive statistics, as you can see, depending on how you ask the question, whether it's egotropic, this one, sorry, or sociotropic, this one, there seems to be variation. So if we're thinking about the self, people do seem to think maybe social protection or social investment is more important. Whereas if you were thinking about the community, maybe infrastructure is more important. The independent variable here is, there's 2. So we asked about victimization, various different types of victimization, and we created an additive score here. And crime victimization is a dichotomous variable within whether or not anyone in the family or yourself has experienced crime in the past year. And just one thing to mention is that, we realize that there's a difference in timing here, but it's not, you can't really necessarily distinguish crime violence from conflict violence during the conflict. So again, that's an area where we welcome suggestions for how to think about the different timing. Okay, and then some descriptive stats on the victimization. So here, note that most people, about 30% of people did not experience war violence, whereas over 20% experienced 3 forms of violence in some form. And then about 20% have been victims of a crime. And then, so this was interesting to us. So when we looked at how this compound victimization, we noticed that actually, like, as people experienced more forms of crime, it also seemed like they were, more forms of conflict violence, it somehow seemed to correlate a little bit with whether or not they were crime victims as well. So I again, that's another area that was a little bit puzzling for us. So we'd love feedback and thoughts about that as well. So I won't go over the model in detail. It's just a simple logistic regression where we're kind of looking at the preferences individually, but then we also have a multinomial logic comparing security preferences to other preferences as well, standard controls as well. And then I'll hand it over to Sarah.
Perfect. Let's jump to the results. Can you show the table? Wonderful. So this is the table which only shows the main independent variables, and we highlighted our main findings with a blue color here. So regarding the first hypothesis, we do find moderate support regarding the impact of war victimization on public goods preferences. So as you can see, experiencing war victimization increases preferences for social investment, but only for egotropic preferences. So those who have been victimized want more social investment, that is probably education, maybe because they have missed out during times of war and want to get it back now. That's why they prefer it. Whereas when we ask about sociotropic preferences on social investment, we find actually a negative significant effect. Looking at crime victimization, we do see that it supports our hypothesis. Those who have been victimized by crime are much significant, more likely to support egotropic provision of security. They want security, police and courts provided for themselves. We do not find anything, we do not find an effect on sociotropic security, which is in line with our expectation. Now, looking at the compound effect of crime victimization and war victimization, we find only support for the last hypothesis, the H3D. So it seems to be the case that crime and war victimization are canceling each other out, so that neither social investment or social consumption nor security is more preferred by those who have been double treatment. It's other type of public goods that they want. It's basic public goods and infrastructure. Next slide. Just quickly the coefficients plot. Here, as you can see, the dark gray spot shows the dots that show the egotropic model, and we see that for our independent variables, only the dark blue points are significant and not the light blue gray ones, which means that we don't find support for the sociotropic preference. Next slide. To summarize the results, support for H1 and H2. Yes, let's go to the conclusion slide. Crime and war victimization have been studied in parallel so far, even though violence experience might have similar impacts. Next. We scrutinize how far public goods preference can be distinguished based on pro-social preferences. And what we find is that we have a positive impact for crime victimization on egotropic security, and only a slight egotropic preference for war victims on social investment. When both are affected, we have a preference change in a way supporting basic goods and infrastructure. Next. So what we show here in this project is a victim-centered approach to public goods provision. And most strikingly, we find, other than what the war victimization literature has promoted, that victimization does not seem to affect public goods preferences for the community. There's no support for a relationship between violence and community activism. All right, thank you. And we look forward to your comments and questions.
Great, thank you so much for that presentation. Let's go ahead and just open the floor. We'll collect some comments first from Nick and then Omar. And Nick, you can take about 5 or so minutes. Like if it goes on, I'll jump in and kind of let you know, but feel free to give more than 1 or 2 comments.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Just to warn you, someone just rang my doorbell and my dog kind of freaked out, but luckily you were spared that by the mute. So first, I'd like to say that this is a very interesting project. It's a great question. As everyone in this room I'm sure knows, there's a ton of research that's starting to look at these or question maybe some of these distinctions we make between political and criminal violence. In addition, there's huge public policy implications from this type of research, especially in post-conflict environments where we see levels of violence continue to be really high. So how citizens are maybe demanding more public security seems to be a really important aspect. In addition, I think, the victimization literature is kind of thin on mechanisms. So this comparison between different types of violence and victimization is really gives us some leverage over what's going on in victims. And then I really like the victim-oriented aspect of the survey, how they perceived, instead of sort of assuming different types of public goods have either egotropic or sociotropic tendencies. So I'll start with maybe just the biggest comments that I have. And the first one has to do with this pretty neat or clear distinction you make throughout most of the paper, and upon which kind of your causal mechanism depends. And that's this difference between conflict-related violence being politically motivated and that is collective in nature, and then crime as being apolitical and individual. And I think, this is maybe a framing issue, but I think it also has impacts on how you're interpreting some of the causal stuff. Because I think it's overall a sort of false dichotomy that we use within the political violence literature, that all criminals are just sort of interested in greed or personal enrichment, whereas, combatants in war are interested in the politics or territorial considerations. And I think that there's a lot of literature on civil war on the one hand that says that there is a lot of the violence that goes on is not actually motivated by politics or territorial considerations, right? I mean, Kalivas is probably the most famous who makes this argument, in which combatants are, or other people not related to the combatants, are more motivated by local cleavages, personal animosities, opportunities for looting or engaging in sexual violence, and even crime. So I think like that on the one hand is problematic to characterize it as all politically motivated. On the other hand, lots of criminal violence is also political. It may not be related to the politics of the state, as criminals are maybe less motivated by party ideologies or ethnic considerations. But a lot of people living within areas where crime is happening definitely understand it as political. It's about local politics. It's about local authority, local order, who has, who does not have within those spaces. So I think even if, we want to consider these two different types of violence, at least breaking it down. And you kind of note on this in a footnote when you mention Mexico. But Mexico is only maybe the most prominent case that we can think of. There's tons of other cases from Latin America, as I'm sure Sarah's well aware. But there's lots of areas in Africa and Asia as well where there's really high levels of violence, and it's not about political competition or ideology. And this impacts not just the framing, but also the causal story you're telling, in that the response to politically motivated violence and the collective nature of it leads people to respond with some sort of pro-social, a pro-social response. Whereas the individual nature of crime leads them to be self-focused. And so I have a couple of questions about that. One, does that have to do with the motivation of the perpetrator? Or is that more about levels of violence? When you get to a certain level of violence in society, does it become a more social or collective phenomenon? So, I mean, you could think about Mexico, but you can think of lots of other cases where crime is really high and lots of people in society have been victimized, and there is a sort of collective element to it. So is it just about levels of violence, or is it about maybe political rhetoric that elites use to characterize the violence according to ethnic or ideological cleavages that make people respond in this collective way? Let's see. So I think there's a couple of ways that you could possibly deal with this in your particular case. I'd like to see what crime actually looks like in this county. Is it individuals engaging in this? You mentioned vigilantism. Are there vigilante organizations? Are there groups of former combatants operating? If there is a more, it doesn't have to be organized crime in the way that we commonly think of it, like cartels or the mafia, but are there gangs operating? Are there groups of individuals that have particular territories within these rural areas? I'd be interested to hear more about that, to really make this distinction that you rely on much clearer. Let's see. I think the other large comment has to do with the temporal dimension of this, and that is that you're asking people about victimization that happened in the conflict sense between a decade and 25 years prior, right? And you're asking about crime which occurred within the last calendar year from when you were surveying them. So I'm wondering if there are temporal dimensions to victimization that could be really important here, right? If I'm 15, 20 years beyond a victimization, do I think about that differently than if you asked me within the year in which it happened? And I'm thinking this matters because maybe in the year, in which you were victimized in some way, you could respond with much more of this more punitive, more egocentric or egotropic tendencies, as opposed to 15, 20 years, you've maybe had the opportunity to deal with it and then think about the consequences, and you come to some different realization. So I'm wondering about the temporal dimension. I have some other comments, but maybe I'll let Omar join in and we can go from there.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing this paper. I find it very interesting, and it's a topic that I think many of us have at least thought about sometime. I'll try not to repeat some of the comments that Nick raised, but I agree with many of them. So I'm going to try to split my comments between the theory, the survey, and then the empirical analysis. Just regarding the theory, one thing that is missing in the current draft, I think, and could be interesting to incorporate it, is to discuss why we're having this discussion in the first place. And I think one of the reasons is because if we look at the incidence of intentional homicides globally around the world, we know that the number one source of intentional homicides is related to criminal activity or to organized crime in recent years, and not anymore to civil wars. And I think that's probably self-evident for us, but it would be interesting to have some discussions along these lines, because a lot of the insights that we have from organized crime are coming from the more like a larger literature on civil wars. Now, you don't really address the issue, or you don't talk much about the role of organized crime in here, as you mentioned in the presentation. And as Nick mentioned, there are many things that overlap, and we know that there are criminal organizations that have some political motivations, and also insurgencies that are not only politically motivated, but also engage in purely criminal activity. And so this makes me think whether the actual distinction in here should be probably more about the type of violence exposure, and probably the severity of exposure to violence, rather than the dichotomy between political versus criminal, or political violence versus crime. And probably what we really care about in here is whether there is a perception of a collective or community problem. And we know, for example, that in some cases, violence associated with organized crime can be perceived as a community problem that I'm not sure is going to be only thought as an individualistic type of violence, as you mentioned in the draft. And probably you're thinking of just pet crime and not organized crime. But given the current state of affairs, I don't see how you can actually write the paper without taking into account the role of organized crime. And probably it also relates not only to the type of violence that is exerted, but also to the organizational features of these groups, either the insurgent groups or the drug cartels or the criminal organizations. From the case of Mexico, at least, which is the node that I know the best, it is very clear that there are drug cartels that really behave as if they were insurgent groups. Similar types of organization, sometimes with explicit political goals, although not really the same as a typical civil war organization. One minor thing is regarding hypothesis 3, which you are trying to address the issue of what would be the expectation when there is exposure to both types of violence or to conflict and crime. And it gave me the impression that, well, in here you basically just said, well, anything could happen, and there wasn't much of clarity in terms of the causal links between the particular type of exposure and the actual expected observable implication. So I think this part probably needs to be rearranged somehow. Regarding the survey, I just had some clarification questions. I think it would be important to add some details about the sampling procedure, probably in the appendix, just to give more details on whether this, what was the sampling frame, whether it was a stratified sample, and just a bit more information on the sampling procedures in general. Regarding the survey items, you have a bunch of sensitive questions, and I was just curious to hear more about what was your experience when administering these questions, because you directly asked about violent, like individual experience of very serious types of, or very severe types of violence. And so I would like to hear where you piloted some of these questions, or whether you think that because of asking this in a direct way, there could be some sort of bias or not. Also, you mentioned that you had you asked in an open-ended fashion the question about preferences towards towards policy, and I see that there are some advantages of that, but there could also be disadvantages in the sense that probably, I don't know whether some of these answers were a bit noisy, or also that when you don't offer some menu of options to answer, probably some individuals just don't recall at in the exact moment one of the their own preferences, let's say. And regarding this point, one thing that I was wondering is, like, I like this distinction between sociotropic and egotropic preferences, and I think the way you asked is also very interesting. But I wonder the extent to which this is actually telling something about sociotropic versus egotropic inclinations of the respondent, if we don't really know how they are weighting their responses. And by that I mean, like, for example, I could say what I think is best for me and what is best for my community, but the next question probably should be, what do you care more about your own individual preference, benefit, or the actual community? Because those are, I mean, the underlying assumption in here is that that one is going to reveal like individual preference and the other is not, but we don't know whether the individual or the respondent gives more weight to one or the other. And finally, regarding when you ask about exposure to violence or civil war experiences and crime, I think it wasn't clear to me why you asked specifically about different types of civil war experience, which I thought it was very, very interesting and clever. But you don't do the same when you ask about crime and put them all together in some category of experience of some crime, which could be relatively minor and or not over the past year. And I think that also, I mean, that's also somehow influenced the kind of response that you are getting. And I just was curious to know why you decided to do it this way. And very, very quickly, just regarding the empirical analysis, it would be convenient just to double check whether, I mean, some of the results that you might not be able to capture the effects because of the size of the sample, specifically because you are also focusing on interactions. And also, it would be interesting to see whether the characteristics of the villages or the communities that you sampled are somehow relevant in order to understand your results. So basically, my question is whether there is some heterogeneity across the different types of these communities in terms of the results that you observe, or whether probably some of your results are driven by the situation or the experiences in one particular region. And well, I'm just going to end there. But thanks again for sharing the paper. I think it's very, very cool.
Thank you so much for those comments. And from here on out, in terms of the discussants, especially as our authors respond, if you want to jump in, you can either unmic and just jump in, or you can two-finger and I'll to the screen and I'll cue you in. And then once they've responded a bit, I'll just directly ask if either of you want to go ahead and add more comments. As your host, but / pseudo semi-discussant, I also just wanted to kind of touch in on that main framing question you're getting. And when I read the paper, I thought, oh, like they've got 3 discussants who have all worked on organized crime to some degree. And I teach some of the authors that you cite in my seminar class, and I love the Barnes article about criminal politics, and I really get my students going on that. And so I was fresh. I just taught that class, and so I was fresh in my mind thinking like, they're definitely going to get comments on this. And I think it's great for you too, but there's a real like decision to me to be made here about whether you want to try hard to kind of hedge against diving into the criminal politics conflict versus civil war bit of a debate that has come out more and more in the literature, sort of shy away from it or dive right in. And I actually think that if you started off the paper, just as like one idea for addressing some of these framing comments, if you started off the paper saying like, a lot of times, yes, not only are these things similar, but in some cases they're distinct and they still happen at the same time. And Barnes's article on this, he has a really nice paragraph that directly talks about the strategic relationship between criminal actors and crime and political actors. And I don't know this case very, very well at all. And so I can't kind of guess or fill in any gaps about whether there's a relationship there, whether there's actors that are criminal actors that are very similar to these sort of stereotypical non-state armed actor types, like in the case of large-scale organized crime in places like Mexico. And it's very hard, if you don't know the case, I think, to know what we're dealing with in terms of these distinctions between crime and more political, quote, I'm putting quotes because I tend to think they're all very similar, but more political armed actors. So I think that you could kind of frame that as a contribution, that you have this unique, or you have this really interesting data that actually does ask about both crime and wartime victimization, but you would need to tell us a lot more about these cases in general, opening and saying that we have these cases where both these things happen, and we need to start understanding the effects of this more. So that was just kind of like one idea about how you might be able to fix or deal with some of these framing questions that you're getting. And with that, I'll see if our authors want to go ahead and respond to some of these comments.
Sarah, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
Maybe you should first, because you probably can better explain the situation in Liberia regarding organized crime and its role, I guess.
Yeah, sure. But before I do that, I wanted to show myself, because I am also teaching a graduate seminar, and I chose the discussants that we wanted based off of my syllabus, which I wanted to show. Nice. Because it's like all of you guys. Very excited. We also had a very lively discussion when we were talking about your piece, Nick. So, okay, so that's why I said this is like the dream team for discussing this paper. So let me just go. I think all of the conceptual stuff makes sense. I really like this idea about severity and thinking about that as a way to cut the divide, or to better conceptualize the divide, or lack of divide rather. So I'm not going to say too much about I think I'm going to just address some of the survey stuff, since I actually all of the conceptual stuff. I'm sure Sarah will also think we take all of that. Okay, where is the survey stuff? Sorry. Okay, so yeah, so I can definitely add details about the sampling procedure. So just to give you a sense, so these were villages from the census that were chosen that had 88 households 82 households or more, which is kind of like, it's like the right size to be able to implement, for it to matter, basically, for the village to matter. And so we randomly chose 10 of these, and these are basically where I didn't do my run the field experiment. So they were, so that's why I didn't want it to taint, we're taking like the control villages. And so it's a representative sample in a sense of the county, but not of the country, right? Let's see here. So then so within the villages, we just basically then randomly selected neighborhoods within the villages, and then they just use a random walk to select households. But we can put all of that in. And then sensitive questions. So this is a great question because there's so much variation in how sensitive questions can be asked in different countries. So, you would think like, maybe why didn't I do a list experiment or like some kind of, other sensitive way to ask sensitive questions? And there's two reasons for that. One, like list experiments don't work in Liberia at all. I've pre-tested it so many different ways, and it just doesn't work. But the other realization is that it's actually a country where people are very open about talking about the violence that they've experienced. Like it's not, so we think of it as like this traumatic experience for most people, but actually a lot of people really feel like open about talking to people about it. So that actually wasn't so much an issue. I imagine that it's an issue in other places, but in Liberia, it's much less of an issue. And I think a reason for that is because there's been so much international attention there, like with a peacekeeping mission, like it just kind of normalizes the discourse of violence in the country, I think. So that was less of a problem. So I was less concerned about any kind of social desirability bias or any kind of bias that may come with sensitive questions. But these are all things we can put into the paper. I really love this point about how we didn't think about the weighting. I had never thought about that. So that was really interesting. I have to think of whether or not there's any other questions in the survey that we should put in as a control for like maybe people's valuing the community more than themselves. I think there's probably something in the survey we could use. We won't be able to weight like how you're suggesting, but it's probably something that maybe we should tone down how much that distinction is important maybe in the paper. And then this point about exposure to violence. So, I mean, when I was running the survey, this wasn't the research question that I had in mind, obviously. I was running a survey for a different reason, hence the more of a battery of questions around wartime victimization than on crime victimization. But the crime victimization question was added in there because that is one of the main problems now in the country. Like that's the main type of violence. And I say violence in quotes because most of the violence is not bodily harm. It's usually like property or theft or stealing or gender-based violence, right? So there's like very few murders, like not even, that's not something that's happening in that county or really in the country that much at all. And so most of it is like, so here I think this makes the case selection important in terms of demonstrating like this is a particular instance where we don't really have that much organized crime or even there's some gangs, but it's not like it's very loosely organized. The most I guess prevalent type of gang violence or even close to cartel would be Nigerian drug mafias that use Liberia as like a transit, but that's like it's not organized that well in the country, but it's not happening in this particular county. So we are talking about like the petty crime, but again, like that, we need to make that much. We need to think about what that means for organized crime and how this fits into our conceptualization much more. Cassie, I like this framing. Sarah, do you want to take over?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you. You addressed already many points, and thank you, Nick and Omar. These are fantastic comments. This is super, super helpful. And I wanted to respond to Omar, your comment on the open-ended question: how far do people actually recall what their preferences are? But I think here, this is actually the advantage. I do not see it as a disadvantage, because I find it hard to imagine that when someone asks me spontaneously, okay, what do you want? Then I can say what I want, like the most important thing. I think it should come to mind. Otherwise, it's not the most important thing, isn't it? So, I mean, I understand what you mean here, but I'm not so worried about that part of it, because I think this is how cognition works to some extent. But I think we should address this. You're right. And Nick, I like your point on timing. I think we have to talk a little more about that and reflect on it in the paper, like what it means that war victimization dates back a lot longer than the crime victimization. And I agree. We need to take a look at the case, how politicians how the public debate is on war violence. Has there been restorative justice and these kind of things? So how do politicians, what is like the dominant strategy, or how is it conceived in the public discourse? How are people dealing with violence and perpetrators and these kind of issues? Yeah, you're totally right. We need to address that. Yeah, I think this was all extremely, these are extremely helpful comments. And I maybe, can I ask a question? How
Sure.
would you suggest what we should do, how we should incorporate organized crime?
Yeah, I was actually going to kind of jump on that as well and see if y'all would rather hear just kind of like more and more comments to collect, or maybe ask to the group, there's this big question coming up, and I would reiterate a point that both Nick and Omar made, which is that the way that you framed it in your paper with respect to this collective versus individual experience as linked to criminal violence or crime versus wartime violence, I think is where at least I got a little bit stuck. And again, I just don't know that much about the case, but I think much earlier on, and Nick, I realize now I was referring to you as your last name earlier, which is kind of hilarious. I've been teaching too much. But earlier on, you have that footnote too, which Nick pointed out. And I work with Sandra, and I don't know that she would, there's so much tension there for me, grabbing some of these Latin American studies that have come up about victimization and these outcomes, and saying oh, well, these are in areas where crime looks really different. We're not dealing with that. I think you have to really start big with that if your argument later on is going to be that we're talking about really lower level kinds of crime that are everyday forms of crimes, kind of quotidian crime that are usually not bodily forms of crime, that aren't usually linked to organized crime. All these things kind of need to be in the beginning. And then when you draw on that victimization literature, I think you can, because we'll understand that you're drawing on it, if anything, almost as more analogous to the literature that looks at the responses to victimization that relate to a larger group. So I would maybe flag that too. And if, I don't know if that feedback is helpful, but if you want to ask to collect feedback on that as it relates to your theory, not just sort of how do we frame deal with organized crime, but how does it relate to your theoretical assumption about individual versus collective experience, we could talk about that as a group. Do you want to, or do you want to collect more feedback?
Yeah, either that would be really helpful, I think.
Yeah, I think theoretically it's difficult for us to really incorporate it, because Liberia is a case where organized crime is just not present. And I think this is why we haven't really brought that into the theoretical argument, right? So I feel like for this particular case, it's difficult for us to theorize about organized crime when we can't really measure it.
So Nick or Omar, what do y'all think about this?
Yeah, I guess, it's hard because so much of the work on criminal violence focuses on criminal organizations and victimization. And that seems like a very different circumstance than what you have here, which is quite rural, right? Most criminal violence is happening in urban areas, at least across the globe. So it's a very different environment. I think, though, that this sort of dichotomy that you set up at the beginning really is going to provoke a lot of us who have put in a lot of work to try to convince political scientists that this is just not the case. Mm-hmm. So if you can frame it in such a way that you include a discussion of how complicated these factors are, while also noting that the crime that we are talking about in this case is much more petty crime, individual levels of crime, and advocating for us to like maybe disaggregate between different types of violence. And in this regard, I think I agree with Cassy in her framing comment. I think one of the ways that you could do that is to think about it as this is a post-conflict environment. Lots of post-conflict environments have high levels of violence still, even though the conflict has come to an end. So it's technically post-conflict, but there's still all this violence happening. And because we've focused like so much of our political violence research on like the period of conflict, we don't yet, I mean, there is some work. Sarah Daly's work is really good in this regard, how she focuses on that transition to, of the groups themselves. But then in other cases, it just leads to like maybe high levels of disorder or a lack of public order in which crime and violence look more like the case that you're focusing on. Mm-hmm. And I think in either regard, it's useful for us to like think about post-conflict circumstances and how types of criminal victimization map on to, or don't map onto, it sounds like, previous forms of victimization. So I think that if you start there, instead of setting up this dichotomy that like immediately I want to tell you differently, and if you like bring us into the conversation, I think that'll really help. And in fact, like I think the compound aspect of this is maybe the most interesting because we often, almost always study them separately. And there's so many cases where they are both present, not maybe at the same, well, I mean, in many cases at the same time during the war, but then afterwards, there's almost always violence that's going on afterwards that we don't really pay attention to. And thinking about how citizens and communities are reacting to that violence, which is usually shaping that post-conflict environment, much more maybe than what happened 10 or 15 years ago, even within the Civil War.
Yeah, and just a two-finger and highlight, I guess, two main points that stood out for me. I really love the emphasis on post-war because you don't do that till later when you introduce the case. And secondly, I think that, so Nick just said, there's tons of cases like this. You could totally start with that. There are a lot of cases. Let's give you some anecdotes to situate you in that space. What kind of area and scope conditions like are we looking at? Because of the literature you cited and who those authors are and what they're talking about, I went a totally different direction until I got to your case and I kind of had to backtrack. So I think those are two really important dimensions of his comments to take home. Omar, did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I think it's very challenging in terms of framing. I usually have, with all these studies about exposure to violence, I usually have a hard time trying to figure out what the actual political content does in the relationship between the exposure to violence and behavior. So what I mean is that I don't see like if the conflict or the violence is of similar scale and similar degrees of severity, I feel inclined to think that there isn't much of a distinction actually between an insurgent group and a drug cartel. So that's what I was saying. Like, I wonder whether what you're capturing here, like empirically, but also like conceptually, is more. It's not that related to actual politics or to political violence, but just to organize violence, if we want to put it in that way. But I don't know. I was thinking like for it, a possible way of proceeding with the paper is probably just to work more on the theoretical aspect of the paper to make it more of a theoretical piece in which you provide some empirical analysis as just something like more like supplementary, but I don't know. I know that that was probably not the initial intention of the of the paper. But what I found more interesting than the empirics is actually the debate on these distinctions between whether exposure to political violence or to crime have different effects on policy preferences.
Do you mind if I just jump in real quick?
Go for it.
So Omar suggested, which I agreed with actually, is focusing on the violence or the victimization more so than like the category of it. But you pointed out that you don't really disaggregate between the types of criminal violence. So which seems like a huge problem, trying to shift around sort of the design of it to like compare much more closely the different forms of violence. So I don't know if that, I mean, unless you have maybe other questions about crime or victimization that I'm not aware of, that might be really difficult to do. But I would have suggested you to do that. Focus much more on the violence. And in fact, like what they share in common in some ways interests me more than how they're different or how they build on to one another. And I think right now the paper is like, we're going to test the political violence hypothesis and the crime violence hypothesis, and then you have all these other compound ones. And so the focus is really on the first two, whereas you might shift it around to shift the focus away from this like dichotomy and more to the compound ones. If you can figure out like an interesting theoretical story, why they map onto each other that way. I think you mentioned in the presentation that I didn't get out of reading it the first time, but those graphs where most of the people who had been victimized during the war were also the victims, or the people who suffered lots of different types of victimization during the war also were victimized by crime. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is this figure 2, Sabrina?
Let me see here. Figure. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I pulled up the presentation. Yeah, it's I'm gonna share screen real quickly.
Cool.
Can you see that?
No.
Nope. Sorry. It's a double. Okay, there. This one.
Yep.
Yeah, it's like this. So like 0 and like very little crime, and then you get to like 4 different kinds or 5 different kinds, and it's like this big jump in victimization, crime victimization for some reason.
So do you have any, I mean, you know this context much better than all of us. Do you have any possible explanations for that? Is this a socioeconomic thing, like the poorest are the most vulnerable, or?
Everybody's poor. I mean, I think that's the thing we should explore. It's like it's clearly a selection, something going on with selection, right? So the same people that are being caught up in war are also being caught up in crime for some reason. So maybe that's like a certain type of people. Maybe more of the elites, or maybe landowners. But that is something we could explore.
Or village level?
This is more intense, right? Forms of, I forget what the 1 through 5 is.
More forms of violence. So they've experienced.
It's additive, and it's an additive indicator,
Yeah.
so they have experienced different ones.
Mm-hmm.
Could it be geographic location of the respondents?
Yeah, I was immediately wondering what Omar just said too. Is there just some overlap, like areas that were hit most hard by the war are also going to have a higher likelihood of crime?
It's possible, although didn't we do?
We tested it. We looked at the covariance metrics, and we didn't see like a distinct pattern. So it seems that crime victimization does equally kind of spread across demographic groups or socioeconomic groups. So we didn't see a particular pattern, but we can take another look.
We also do have village fix effects in there, don't we, Sarah?
We do. Yeah.
Like, yeah. I don't know.
So it's more individual. So it's like it doesn't cluster around villages. It's more like those individuals within each village are just more likely to experience violence politically or post-conflict criminally.
Yeah.
one has to note that like the last category, like those who experience 5 types of war victimization, it's a very small group. So we do see this positive correlation, but the groups also become smaller. Like the largest group is number 3, who have experienced 3 different types of war victimization. But then 4 and especially 5 is really small. Like it's I think like 5% of the sample or so. So
you might consider finding a way to convey the stratification of the sample here of percents or.
Good idea. This is a new graph that we put together. So
yeah, we have to
play with it a little more. That's a good point that Sarah made.
Also, on the comments that you got from Omar about this, like maybe it's a person type, and you were sort of saying I don't really know how to deal with that. I'm not sure either, but I did have this immediate question where I've kind of been asked before whether people who report victimization are just more like outgoing, more social, more trusting of other people, like ready to just share stuff, and so that there's just a personality bias in reporting. And I wonder, just to help you think of things, if you have any like personality or social behavior-ish kind of stuff. I usually don't, so I usually just have to be sad. But maybe you have something you could look at.
Yeah, there's a whole battery of like post-survey questions about the person. So like there might after we look at what there's something there that we could look at there. I'm sure there's something in the survey that we could use for proxy for that. That's a good idea.
Are there any data on crime rates or murders, homicides that you could use just to see whether, probably, it might be the case that all these people are located in a highly violent area, or some of them?
So no, the answer is no, just because data doesn't really exist. So I've been to the police depots and such, and it's like you can't really use the stuff that's there. It's like you have like one day, and then like you'll go for like 2 weeks, and then there's like another day that's so like and police data in general, like that's more about reporting anyway. So self-reporting is like the best option usually in this particular context. Yeah. That's one of the challenges of the weakest of the weak states and weakest of the weak counties.
We have a couple more minutes left. Do either of the discussants want to sort of list out any additional comments maybe they had for take-home points?
I'm just gonna raise or repeat probably myself a bit, but raise the question of so if you write this paper about political violence versus crime exposure, I think it's important to have in mind how this is going to be a different story from the story of organized violence versus disorganized violence or crime. And it's not clear to me whether there is a clear distinction, but probably there is. I mean, a clear distinction between organized violence and political violence. That's my main point. And I know that because of the context, you are talking about a case of political violence, but like just theoretically, the way you outlined your hypotheses and expectations, I'm having a hard time trying to think of those as conceptually different things.
Can I just respond real quick? I actually think that this is the most, like, both of you making this point makes it very clear that like we could write, I think we could reframe the paper, rewrite the paper along those terms, right? So organized violence is, could take on a more collective approach, whether that's organized crime or insurgent groups versus like individualistic like crime. I think that's the way to go moving forward. So I think we're gonna just take that, probably reframe around that, because I think and that it also addresses this question about severity, right? So like if you're, I think organized groups are more that type of violence is more severe as opposed to like your person who just lost a job who's gonna steal a backpack, right? which is this other type. But both types, I think, are very common, like we said, in society, in post-conflict countries. So but we don't pay attention. We really don't pay attention to that latter in political science. That's like a sociology question. So bringing that in, but then I think taking everything that both of you have said about, this false dichotomy between organized crime and insurgent groups is spot on. So I think, obviously Sarah and I will discuss, but I think that's been super helpful.
Yes, I fully agree. I think it makes a lot of sense to incorporate organized crime here and rather map it with the war victimization rather than trying to flesh out the distinction between war, organized crime, and petty crime or individualistic crime. I think that is actually a great idea to think a little bit more take a step back and then think about the commonalities between organized crime and war, and distinguish that from crime victimization that is more like petty crime, which does occur elsewhere as well. And I think this is important to incorporate the criminology literature and the literature that does look at normal petty type of crime that is not organized.
Did I see a two-finger there from Nick?
Oh, yeah. So I was just going to say that I think one useful thing for you might be in Kalivas's 2015 article where he's comparing organized crime and civil war. He talks about how where civil war happens is generally the bottom billion or the weakest, poorest states, whereas where criminal violence really escalates are actually in middle income, relatively stable, democratic countries. So you're very much talking about crime that occurs in the former category, which is very different from the territorial, very instrumental organizations that we see in Mexico and Central America even and Brazil and other places. So that's just a way to further. I mean, I think it's going to be useful because so many people are focusing their research on the really high levels of criminal violence. We're going to ignore most of the low crime places and then, assume that that's not shaping public policy or politics, but that's absolutely not the case. And I think there's a good argument to be made that we need to also focus on even the lower levels of violence, which is what you're doing. And the combination that has, or the comparison that we can make between criminal violence and political violence in that regard. Not just a more organized insurgent style aspect that we often talk about.
And that's our strongest finding too, which is nice, right? I mean, that just demonstrates the importance of what you just said, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as a quick two-finger on that, I think another place to continue to flesh out this organized experiences with organized violence versus these lower level types of crime and sort of everyday types of crime is actually in your case selection description. I found that super high level for something that's really trying to flesh out experiences with violence. And again, not knowing the case well, I wasn't really sure. We're talking about what kinds of violence and what is the individual's distance to this violence or discriminate and indiscriminate violence, these big ways that we talk about violence during wartime. And then I think when you build that up with anecdotes, and I know you know this case super well, so it will be really easy for you you can then say and here's some crime, some examples of very everyday kinds of types of crime. I think it will become very salient for the reader quite quickly. And I don't know what else you could probably draw from a lot of your field research there to use anecdotes or even maybe quotes from folks who you've talked to. I think it would make it a very nice illustration of that. So I think we're about at the end here. If anyone has a final pressing, what about that one coefficient, you can raise your hand and I'll make time for you. But if not, I'll just say thank you so much to our discussants. This really is volunteer discussants is what makes this possible and valuable. And I always hear back from people that it's super helpful and it's nice to just have this space to truly workshop a paper, not necessarily have to defend and freak out about a paper, but just get to workshop your ideas and get some feedback. So thank you very much for both of you for taking the time to read this paper. It's also my job to flag that we have another presentation coming up on May 8th, and you can go to our PSS online colloquia.wixsite.com/OPSC/schedule if you would like to see more information about our next talk. The authors, you'll get a message from us letting you know when this is up online. But thank you so much, everyone, and have a good rest of your Friday afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
And evening in Germany.
And there you go. And nighttime.
Actually, night.
So.